Welcome to Senior Compass, and I'm just super excited. We have a phenomenal guest on today, and it's one that I met a while ago at the center, and our story is perhaps a little interesting, and it's just been a fun to get to know her. But with that, I'd like to say welcome to Julie Walker. Julie, welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So before we get started, my most famous question on the show is, where did you grow up?
I grew up in New Richmond, Wisconsin, which is right across the border. It's essentially 30 minutes into Wisconsin. If you know the River Falls, Hudson, Stillwater area, that's right around there. Those are the famous towns. New Richmond's not. But those are the ones that you'd know. I grew up there my whole life, and then I went to school at UW Eau Claire.
Okay.
And then I moved to Belle Plaine, Minnesota. I was going to study sign language interpretation in the cities while my partner went down and studied communication studies at Mankato. My work kind of fizzled out, so we moved to Mankato because it was right in the middle, you know. So we were gonna.
I'm following it.
Yep. And then my work kind of fizzled out a little bit for a lot of reasons. So we moved away from Belle Plaine down to Mankato. I got my graduate degree. He finished his graduate degree. We moved to Georgia for a year. And then the job opened up at SMSU, and that's how we got here.
Okay, I'll say that's a long, crazy route.
Yeah, it's the roundabout way to get here. It's the scenic route to Marshall.
Route?
Yeah, I don't know if you knew that. You can get from Marshall to New Richmond in about 4 hours. I like it to take about 5 years.
5 years?
Yes, yeah,
That's
roughly.
how long it took?
Well, I think it was actually 7, but yeah, something along those lines.
So
the scenic route is more fun.
So SMSU is what brought you to town?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful.
Yep.
And that was how many years ago? About?
6 years ago we came to town for it.
Okay.
Yeah, because my first child was 6 years. I was born 6 years ago. So.
Yeah, be right on target.
Yeah.
Definitely, that makes sense to me.
Yeah.
So here's a question off the cuff. When you first came to Marshall, what was your first impressions of the town?
The water tastes terrible. That was my first impression.
I love that.
I'm sorry, and that's not gotten any better for me. I'm a little bit of, I didn't ever think I'd be a water snob, but I came here and the water is, it's got its own particular brand, which is interesting. But what I really love about Marshall is I love the people here.
Okay.
There's definitely a sense of community, and not everybody's community is the same community. So like everybody's kind of got their spaces, but you can find your community here. And I have found some amazing friends here and some just absolutely incredible, passionate, loving, gorgeous humans here, which is so much fun. And this is the size town that I grew up in. I mean, it's a little bit bigger because this town had a Walmart and a Shopko. I mean, rip Shopko, of course. But like, you know, I grew up in a town that it was big news when the Walmart came to town, you know.
Right.
We had 2 farm implement stores, but we did not have a Walmart at the time.
Well, we used to have many farm implement stores downtown. We were talking about that earlier. But that's another topic. So today we're here to talk about MAST.
Yes.
What is MAST?
So MAST is the Marshall Area Storytellers.
Right.
We're a group of people who just love telling stories.
Right.
It's a little bit weird because you think like, oh, it's an organization, so there's like official members. Well, no, not exactly.
Right.
Okay, so anybody can be a part of MAST? Yes, absolutely. Okay, but like who comes to your shows? Anybody. So so it's a little bit confusing.
Right.
But basically what we are is we're a group of people who love to look at life and find the stories in the everyday, especially.
Right.
My partner Ben and I co-founded this in 2015, 16, something like that. Several years ago. I'd have to look at the website to see when we actually co-founded it. Several years ago, and it's an idea that has been rolling around in my head for a long time because I've always loved storytelling and I've always loved storytelling shows.
Right.
I think that stories are incredibly powerful. We always think about stories in a lot of different ways, like fables and fairy tales and once upon a times. And I mean, there's those kind of stories too.
Right.
But I'm always more interested in the stories that people don't think to tell.
Right.
Everybody has stories. It was like, well, I'm not a storyteller. Well, tell me about your morning.
Yeah. Because there's a story.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think so much of the time, because we think of storytelling as once upon a time, or these fairy tales, or Aesop and his collection of whatevers, you know, I think because we think of it as these big, grandiose things, we forget that the everyday stories are just as meaningful
Right.
and make up more of who we are as individuals.
Right.
And that's what I think is so interesting and beautiful about storytelling.
Right.
Because when you choose to tell a story about me, I learn so much about you.
Right.
Like the first story you told with Mast, you
Yep.
told a story about the tomato.
Right.
And I learned so much about you. I learned so
Right.
much about what you value, about what you think is important, about how you live your life, that
Right.
you're a puddle jumping kind of human,
Right.
that you're a little bit of a troublemaker and that never
Not me.
left. No, not you, right? You
Yeah,
should share
well,
some of that story. That's such
yeah.
a good one, you know?
Yeah, yeah, with the tomatoes. My
Yeah.
brother, yeah. My perfectionist brother. Yeah, it's a wonderful story, and perhaps I should share it with the seniors. That would
Yes.
be fun
Yeah.
to do that. It's interesting that you picked up that I'm a little bit of a troublemaker. This morning at our exercise class, now here comes the story. I'm ratting on you guys. The exercisers, so we usually have like 3 rows of 7 to up to 10 chairs in a row. Well, just like in any classroom, nobody wanted to be in the front. They all started moving to the back. So I went up and got Heather, and Heather went on. I can tell you that Barb took a shower this morning, so it's good to sit in the front row. And nobody moved up, so then they said, oh, so you guys didn't take showers. So we just kind of turned it, but it's just fun to see that interaction and how they react. But we do have something up our sleeve for them, but we're not going to share it out.
Oh,
We always got
cliffhanger.
something to come up with, and they're going, oh no, what are those two going to do? So we're going to leave it a cliffhanger.
Okay. All
So
right.
it's always fun. But like you said, everyday life, just like that situation this morning told you that what I was doing, and that the seniors know to have as much fun as we like to have fun.
Right.
And so it's just that. So talk a little bit about you and I going about our daily lives. I mean, do you have moments where you go, oh man, that was just an amazing story. I should really just like chuck it in my head and just keep it there.
Sometimes I do. Sometimes I say, oh, this is going to be a good story someday, but it's not a good story today.
Right.
That is more often what I think.
Right.
But then there's other times where I sit down because I've been asked to tell a story, or we've got a show coming up, or
Right.
I think about a time when I need to illustrate a lesson to my little children or my older children, and
Right.
it just kind of comes together. You know, you think, you know, when you have those flashes of genius where you're like, wow, this connects to this. And it doesn't even say that in the instruction manual for this bookshelf I'm putting together. Like you
Right.
just flash of genius. Sometimes you get to kind of see those.
Right.
But I have a specific incident that I can remember that at the time I was thinking, this sucks, but it's going to be a good story.
Yeah.
We were driving down to Memphis, Tennessee for a family vacation.
Okay.
And as we were driving along, our van was acting up just a little bit. It was very noisy on the driver's side front
Okay.
wheel. And we couldn't figure out quite what was going on. And we were driving down the Avenue of Saints, which I didn't know was a name that they called the road that connects St. Louis and what's the other one? St. something or other. I can't remember now.
Can't remember, but I know.
But you
the
know what
area.
I'm
Yeah,
talking
yeah,
about.
Yeah.
St. Paul and St. Louis, that's what it
Yeah.
is. It's called the Avenue of Saints.
Yeah.
So we were driving down that. We were in the middle of nowhere, Iowa. And I mean the middle of nowhere, which is going to be important for you to remember in about 10 seconds.
Middle of Iowa, got that?
Middle of Iowa, nowhere, all right?
Nowhere.
Nowhere. On the Avenue of Saints, and it starts to really, it's like shaking that side of the car. So we pull off to the side, and I say, you know, there's this little driveway here. Let's back into the driveway. And as we're backing into the driveway, kids in the back of the van, we hear this big ka-chunk, and the front of the part of the van kind of falls over.
Okay.
And that's never a good sign when one of the, so we
No,
go out to the
not good.
front. No, we go out to the front, and of the 5 studs that hold the tire on,
Yeah.
3 of them had broken off.
Oh my gosh.
Not just like the things that come
The
undone.
bolt, it was the
whole thing had
snapped.
snapped off, and there was 2 more that were loose, and that was the ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk we'd heard on the outside of the van.
Sure.
We have no idea how this got started, other than perhaps there was somebody who had an overexcited automatic
Wrench.
wrench
Yeah.
that just really kind of ripped into it and perhaps had cracked something the last time they had rotated tires or something along those lines, which happens, I suppose. But all of a sudden, you know, we have these 3 little children in the back.
Right.
At the time, we had 3 children. We were in the middle of nowhere. We were supposed to drive another 6 hours that night. We had 13 hours the next day. So we're like 4 hours into our trip, and it's a long trip down to Memphis. And it's 4:30, so all the tow truck places are closed. There's no car rental places. Even if there was, we're not going to be able to rent a vehicle that's going to be able to put all of our littles in the back. So I mean, it was just, it was a mess. And I mean, the ever-present, like, we could have just all died, you know? So like that we had to put out of our minds because the littles were kind of freaking out. Like, what's wrong with the car? Why aren't we driving to Grandma's house anymore? Like,
we'll
sorry, we'll get there when we
okay.
can. So, you know, there was this amazing tow truck company that came and they brought us up and they fixed our vehicle and they got us to a hotel and we had to ride in the back of a police cruiser. Turns out children don't have to ride in their car seats in the back of a police cruiser. At least this time they didn't.
Oh, wow.
Because we wouldn't have all fit. They would not all.
Oh, sure.
Because they were all in booster seats at the time. So it was. I have a picture of them sitting in the back, and James still talks. My second child. He still talks about the time that he rode in the police car and all these different things. So at the time, though, it was just this really scary moment because without saying that I did this, hypothetically, sometimes a mom will go into the back of a vehicle to hand out snacks or something along those lines. And hypothetically, that could have happened right before the wheel fell off the car. So had that happened, that mother would have been thrown all over the vehicle and possibly had some pretty nasty injuries. So,
no kidding.
at the time, it was very scary and tense. And what are we going to do? And how do we manage this? And how do we do a hotel? And what do we tell the people we're going to see? And all these different things. But now it's this kind of a
fun
story about the time the wheel tried to fall off.
And your son remembers riding in the back of the police car. That was like probably one of his most memorable vacations.
Well, I mean, it's one of his only vacations, but it's probably
very memorable. And you know, that kind of is interesting with storytelling. So when you go out in the community, do you have topics or is it just whatever you want to tell?
It's a little different, actually, depending on the situation. So we usually do a story around the holidays, and usually that's got some kind of a holiday theme to it. So I'll tell the people that want to tell a story that time, pick a time or an event that happened between Thanksgiving and New Year's, because there's a whole lot of holidays. It's very kind of spanning across a lot of different traditions and cultures. We want to leave that open to whatever it is. And we've had people tell stories about Christmas. We've had people tell stories about caroling. We've had people tell stories about holidays that they've created with people that they love. So sometimes we have these themes. We actually have a show coming up on the 29th. That's the theme is Journeys. Because one of the storytellers that was with us from the very beginning, Larry Montello, passed away this month. And the first story he ever told with us was about hitchhiking across the United States and about traveling, and he loved traveling. So in kind of in celebrating his memory, we wanted to tell a story about stories about journeys. So it's kind of a broad prompt, and that lets people take that as they will as they're thinking about journeys. Because you could tell journeys about literal cross-country journeys, or how I learned who I am, or the journey of falling in life or in love, or whatever. And then there's other times where I say, you know, I want to have an event. I think this will be fun. Let's just come together and do this. So kind of just depends on how I'm feeling when I put the poster together.
Definitely. So have you gotten the group together at many places in the Marshall community? Do you have certain places that are like, oh, can you come back?
Yes, we've been invited several places, which is really exciting. Mast, like I said, we've been going on for about 5 years, and I think we've done 20 shows or so in various places. We've been invited by Boulder Estates and by Heritage Point has had us back several times. Hill Place has had us a few times.
Okay.
Hill Place, maybe it was not Hill Place. Maybe
Hill
it was
Street
Hill
Place.
Street Place.
You're
yeah.
close.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
You're close.
I got half of it.
Susie understands.
Yeah, thank you. We've had. We've been invited to the Adult Community Center. That was one of my favorites that we got to go to when you invited us for the Thanksgiving celebration.
Yeah.
That was so much fun. We've performed a couple times at the Daily Grind. We've performed at Mayfac. We've performed at Proud Brothers a couple times. We've performed here on campus a couple times.
Okay.
We were invited up by the city of Watson to do a storytelling clinic at one point.
Okay.
So we did something with, we did a storytelling side of it, and Charlie Roth did a music writing side of it, and kind of did this thing. So that was really fun.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been really incredible,
Right.
the number of places and the way that we've been embraced by the community.
Oh, wonderful.
Yeah.
So let's talk about people are out there listening. What if someone says, "Oh, I might be interested, but I can't tell a story"? What would you say to them?
Oh, well, let me just say, I am so glad that you're thinking about it. Because at the very least, I want everybody to start thinking about our lives as being storied.
Right.
A lot of times I think we think of a story as being a noun. It's a thing, I can type it out, it's now in a book, and now it is just there.
Being sold and people can buy it.
Right, and if
No.
it's not that, then it's not a story. But I don't think of stories that way.
Right.
I think that limits us, and it limits the creative ways that we can think about our lives and what we experience.
Right.
And I think of a story as more of a verb. Because as I think about things like, one of the stories that I think a lot of people have, especially if you're in a relationship or a long-term relationship, you think about the story of how you first met.
Right.
So people are going to ask you, Barb, how'd you meet your husband?
You'll never know.
Yeah, right? And that's fine, right?
No,
you don't have
I'm
to tell,
just
right?
kidding.
But you have this story and you tell it so many times because it's one of those questions people ask you.
Yeah.
So you get really good at telling that story.
Right.
And sometimes you get so good that you and maybe he have certain parts. You
That
remember
are
that?
Slightly different or together. Yeah.
Together, right.
Yeah.
So he might tell a story, you might tell a story, you might have a story you tell together that might be just a little bit different.
Right.
You might have like, when you're in your together story, you've probably perfected it to the point where it's like, and then he said, and then he says, well, I did this. And then you say, and I just thought that was the cutest thing in the whole world, right?
Yeah.
You get that over time. The first time you tell the story, it's like, well, we were at the grocery store and, you know, so it's a little awkward, but over time you tell this and it becomes this living creation and it becomes this origin story for you.
Right.
Whereas some stories end up being a little bit different. You know, you tell a story of, when I tell the story of when I gave birth to my first child,
Right.
that story is a little different depending on if I'm talking to a mom who's going to give birth soon. Because I want her to know some of the stuff you don't read about in the pregnancy books or that like don't.
Really?
Yeah, I know. They leave some of the juicy parts out. Can I say that, or is that too inappropriate?
No, I think we can say that.
Okay. They leave some of it out, you know, which left me feeling really unprepared, you know.
Right.
So, like, for instance, when I got time to push, I didn't know what that meant.
Right.
They're like, okay, just do it. Just bear down. I'm like, there's no bears here. I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
So I never learned about the muscles I would need to use or what might be a similar kind of feeling that I had had in the past.
Right.
And I want people to know that, you know, so I'll tell that story a little differently versus if I'm telling it to a primarily male audience who won't necessarily go through it and aren't used to all the details.
Right.
I sometimes will edit a little bit of that out. I won't edit all of it out because I think everybody needs to know about these things.
Yeah.
But I will edit out some things based on who I'm telling the story to
Right.
and what purpose I want them to have. Right now, when my kids ask, well, tell me where babies come from, I tell that story a little differently to my littles, my 6 and 5 and 5-year-old.
Yeah.
My 19-year-old knows, and she's had plenty of classes to teach her about this. She doesn't need me to teach that. But my littles are starting to ask those questions now, and
Yeah.
we got to kind of decide how we're going to answer that and what
Right.
details we're going to include and which ones they're not quite ready for yet.
Right.
So we do this all the time naturally.
Right.
So anybody who would say, I don't have a story, but I'm kind of interested in what you're doing, that is your first step to
Yeah.
realizing that you do have stories.
Right.
And to really, to think about your life and the beautiful things you get to experience
Right.
as parts of who you are, and all these different experiences that you've had make up who you are.
Right.
When you've experienced some things, like after you've experienced childbirth, things are just a little bit different.
Yeah, just a little.
Just a tiny bit. That experience is pretty formative.
Yeah.
In the same way that, getting into a car accident can be pretty formative.
Right.
Or, going to reading a really interesting book, going to a really interesting
Right.
class, visiting a really beautiful place.
Right.
Sometimes when you visit a place, you just feel so inspired, and everything is different because of it.
Right.
You can't look at the world in the same
Right.
place anymore.
Right.
In
It's
the
just
same
so
way.
very, very different. The other thing that was striking me as you were talking is it's amazing how if we would have a recorder in our office every day, how many stories are actually told to us every single day. And the stories that I know that I wish their families knew. Some of them are pretty darn interesting, to say the least. Some of them are probably sides of their parents or grandparents that they would never, ever see or guess. But it's so important because I think all of us as humans, we have many facets that makes us up as a person. Sometimes when you're down and you're visiting and you go to a place, you say, okay, maybe I need to be on better behavior than I usually am.
What are you talking about? You? No.
Yeah. So, and I think sometimes we get into those situations where we just feel we have to be this person, but it's been amazing working at the center. I get to see this person, but then when they come in and visit, I get to see more of the person. And I know stories in this community. I know where some of the rotten eggs fell. I know where some of the rear end gears went. And I know where some of the pumpkins ended up at. That is so interesting because I don't think the families know those stories. Or even going back to the historical piece of, just going back to your hometown, ask your grandparents, what did they do on Saturday night? They didn't go downtown every night. And that's a story in itself because there was 2 furniture stores, and I've had many seniors in Marshall tell me one was a Catholic furniture store and one was a Lutheran. Now I'm going, really? Was the furniture different? Nope. If you went Catholic, you went to that one. If you were Lutheran, you went to that one. I'm going, it's those pieces that we just miss out on. And there used to be a fountain in the middle of Main Street and College Drive where the horses would water. Who would picture that in Marshall? So there's also, I feel like, the storytelling that really has those historical pieces woven within the story from their perspective. And lots of times I'll ask seniors, well, tell me about it. Well, this is just what I know, but I don't know if it's the truth. And I go, but it is the truth. It's what you lived. It's what you experienced. It's your story, basically, right?
It is.
Yeah. And I think people miss that piece in that flow from generation to generation because we don't want them to know that we did this. But there is, basically, you may not tell your kids, but it might be an appropriate time to tell your grandkids or your kids after they've reached adulthood and they may not try some of those things. Just share some of those stories.
What things here, Barb? Now I want to know what's happening.
Well, I learned something with my dad after I became an adult, that him and a friend would drive around in this car, and back there they could fit 2 6-packs of beer next to the engine. You can't do that anymore. And they would go out on a Saturday night and they would drink their beer, So, they wouldn't tell us that as we were growing up.
Right.
Not the right time, but it was a wonderful story to pass down. Of course, there's more to the story.
Of course.
the trouble those two got in and the mud puddles they got stuck in. So, you know, it's just really interesting because it is also a piece of family history and a piece of the character of who that person is. And I think so often we miss that when we don't share those stories. So I don't know if you got a response to that. Or
Well, I mean, I'm here for this. Like, I'm all snapping here for you. That's what I'm at.
Yeah.
I think that you've hit it perfectly there. I think when we think of a story as that thing that gets printed in a book and only these people get to do it and all that, we really downplay the significance of our own lives.
Right.
And what we live every single day.
Right.
If we weren't telling stories, our conversations would be very short. Barb, are you well today? Yes, I am well.
No, I'm
Go be
wonderful.
well.
That's what I always say.
Right, you're wonderful. Right, I'm wonderful. Fabulous. Bye. There's not a lot to say, right?
No.
But we care about each other's stories. We want to hear our stories. We want to hear even the mundane things. That's like there was the fountain where the horses, drank water.
Right.
That fundamentally changes the way you think about Marshall. It gives you a more nuanced view of the world and where we've come from and where we're going.
Right.
And I think that's so fascinating, especially because so many people think that their stories aren't important enough, that they don't bring their stories forward.
Right.
And when we hear more perspectives and we hear more people's stories, we can be more sure of who we are and more sure of, and more open to what the rest of the world is. Because you might tell a story that might be different than what I would tell for a story. I might tell a story that's going to be a little bit different from yours.
Right.
I use the term partner for my husband.
Right.
You use the term husband.
Right.
Both of us have loving, wonderful relationships.
Right.
But by understanding, you can hear and say, you know what, I'm going to keep using husband. That's where I want to do it. And I can hear yours and say, you know what, I'm going to keep using partner.
And that's okay.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
And we can just understand more about the world and understand more about who we are as ourselves and see that other people, I mean, when you hear somebody else's story, you can't help but see them as a person, not just as a sack of meat that's walking around with a mouth and teeth and stuff,
Right.
We are more than sacks of meat.
Right.
And I use that in a really literal sense because, if we forget each other's humanity, if we forget the ways that we can relate with one another, if we become sacks of meat to one another, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
You know? I mean, so much of what we can learn from other people through their stories is what got them to here. The fact that I took the roundabout way to get to Marshall. There's a whole bunch of journeys to get there, exactly, The fact that your brother's a bit of a neat freak, the fact that you've got a mischievous side and you need to maybe alter your behaviors just a little bit from time to time. If somebody was walking past you in the street, they wouldn't necessarily know about your mischievous side, that you've got some puckishness occasionally, Just like when somebody may look at me, they may see me and make certain assumptions about me. I mean, I wear purple hair on purpose, for instance, because I think that it gives people a chance to see that I have a little bit of puckishness also, a little playfulness, but also to see that somebody with purple hair can be a college professor and be multiply published and be in multiple books. And so this difference in my life, this different kind of thing outside of the norm, doesn't necessarily carry with it the stories that people would assume. And so when we share our stories, I think that we help each other build our humanity. Truly.
And I love that you're going to be doing the next storytelling on Journey. I mean, that is just so immensely broad. And so it's so interesting because at where I work, I'm seeing them at perhaps coming to the end of their journey, but they're living the best life of those that have aged to those ages. And then seeing their willingness to, I always say, just to go blah. And it's just amazing. I mean, I know Heather and I just said on Tuesday, we should have written a book. We should have written these stories down, not with names, but just because so often as we listen to a story, we begin to understand that your journey is so different than my journey. And they're never meant to be the same, but we can learn from each other's journeys. And I think that's that's really what, to me, storytelling is we begin to understand a little bit of their journey instead of just saying, oh, can you believe that that person said that? It's like, no, it's our journey. So let's end with that.
Yeah.
The next mass storytelling is...
It's going to be July 29th. From 6 to 7 p.m. at the Mainstay Cafe. I have to think about that because forever my version is the Daily Grind.
Yep.
But from 6 to 7 p.m. at the Daily Grind, Mainstay,
Yeah,
Mainstay Cafe in downtown Marshall.
Okay.
They'll have coffee and all the fixins there available for purchase, and we'll have a great storytelling lineup.
Okay.
We've already got Crystal Watts, who's been on the masked stage several times.
Right.
We've got Ron Shong, and I'm going to say his name correctly for perhaps the first time. As I always say it wrong. He's going to be sharing a story also.
Okay.
And then it's going to be a great lineup, and we'd love for people to come on out and hear some stories. And if you're not able to get out, we understand that, but we'll have those available online afterwards because it's not always about the live performance. It's about sharing the bits of humanity we have with each other.
Right. And my challenge out to those who watch the show, come in and tell me your journey story. I'm all ears. So with that, Julie, it's been wonderful having you on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And may your journey continue.
Thank you, and to you as well. Thank you.